When you first looked at me, you probably thought I was just another stray, thin and dirty, a nameless shadow moving between alleys. But I was more than that. I was a survivor. My ribs pushed against my skin, my fur had fallen out in patches, and my legs trembled every time I took a step. Yet somehow I was still alive. For 40 long days, I survived on nothing more than crumbs of bread, tiny pieces left behind by strangers who never once looked down to notice the eyes that followed their every movement. I was invisible to them, but the hunger in my belly was louder than the silence of their footsteps. If I had not found those scraps each night, I would have vanished into the darkness forever. Instead, I clung to life, one crumb at a time. I wasn't always this way. I wasn't born on the streets, though the streets eventually became my prison. I remember warmth once, the smell of a kitchen, the sound of laughter that filled the air. I remember being smaller with paws too big for my body, tumbling across the floor and being scooped up into hands that smelled of soap and safety. There was a woman who used to hum while she filled my bowl with food, and a boy who tied ribbons around my neck and laughed when I barked at my own reflection in the window. For a while I belonged. For a while I was loved. But life has a way of turning without warning. One day, the boy didn't come to play. The woman didn't hum. The man with tired eyes looked at me as though I was one more burden he couldn't carry. And then, the door opened and I was pushed outside. The door shut again, and it never opened for me. I waited. I scratched. I whimpered. But no one came. And slowly the realization sank into my bones. I was no longer theirs. I was no one's. At first I didn't understand. I thought it was a mistake. I thought perhaps if I waited by the gate, they would return, scoop me up, and laugh about how silly it had all been. But days passed. Rain fell, soaking my fur. Nights grew colder, and my stomach screamed louder. The gate never opened again. I wandered through streets, sniffing for familiar scents, hoping to catch even a trace of them. But the world had shifted, and I was a stranger in it. I learned quickly that the streets are not gentle. They are filled with sharp sounds, hard boots, and the constant ache of hunger. Some people kick at dogs like me. Some throw stones. Others pretend we don't exist at all. And so I learned to live like a ghost, slipping between shadows, watching from corners, never staying too long in one place in case someone decided I didn't deserve even that sliver of space. It was during those early days that I found my first crumb of bread. I had been following the scent of food down a narrow street lined with stalls. The air was thick with spices and grilled meat, but all I could find were discarded pieces of paper and wrappers soaked in grease. My paws were bleeding from walking over broken glass, and my body shook with exhaustion. Then I saw it, a crust of bread, small and hard, lying forgotten near a trash bin. My nose twitched, my heart pounded, and I rushed to it as though it were treasure. I bit into it, and though it was stale and tasteless, tears burned behind my eyes. It was food. It was life. That single crust carried me through one more night, and so began my ritual. Every evening, when the world quieted, I searched. I sniffed the sidewalks, pawed through garbage piles, and waited near benches where people fed pigeons. Sometimes I found nothing. Sometimes, if luck was kind, I found crumbs. It was never enough to fill me, never enough to stop the hunger gnawing at my belly, but it was enough to keep me alive. One crumb became 10, 10 became 20, and so I counted my survival not in days or nights, but in tiny broken pieces of bread. Hunger changes you. It sharpens your senses, teaches you patience, and makes every sound and scent a map to possible survival. I could hear the crinkle of a paper bag from streets away. I could smell bread long before I saw it. But hunger also strips you down, takes pieces of who you once were, until all that is left is instinct and endurance. I forgot how it felt to run freely in a field, to roll in grass, to feel hands scratching behind my ears. I forgot my name, the sound of the boys' laughter, the warmth of belonging. All I knew was survival. My ribs became sharper, my eyes more hollow, but my spirit refused to collapse. Every night I told myself, one more day, just one more day. Breadcrumbs became my promise. As long as I could find even a single piece, I would keep going. Yet each night carried the same fear. What if tonight there was nothing? What if I searched and found only empty wrappers, only scraps too moldy to eat, only silence where once pigeons pecked? That fear clung to me heavier than the hunger. Sometimes I went 2 or 3 days without even a crumb. Those were the hardest nights. My legs buckled, my head spun, and I dreamed of food that never came. Still, something inside me pushed forward, a whisper I couldn't ignore. Keep moving, keep living. Your story is not finished yet. I don't know how I survived those 40 days. By logic, by reason, I should have faded away into the cold ground. Another forgotten stray no one would mourn. But something greater kept me walking, paw after paw, toward the faintest hope of rescue. I began to realize that maybe survival wasn't only about crumbs of bread. Maybe it was also about faith, about waiting for a moment when someone, anyone, would finally see me. I didn't know it then, but my story was only just beginning. The nights grew longer as my body grew weaker. The first week was the easiest, though even then, the pangs of hunger twisted my insides like knives. I still had some strength, enough to move quickly if danger appeared, enough to trot from one alley to the next in search of discarded food. But with every passing day, I slowed. My legs no longer carried me swiftly. Instead, each step felt like dragging weights tied to my paws. My fur lost its shine, falling in tufts, leaving bare patches that stung under the rain. My breath came in shallow pants, not from running, but from the effort of simply standing upright. And yet, even in this decline, I clung to a single thought: survive until morning. Bread became my compass. I learned to follow the smell of bakeries, even after they closed. Some nights I would wait near the back doors where workers carried out trash bags. The bags sometimes split open, scattering tiny treasures across the ground. Half a slice hardened by air, crust too rough for humans, but perfect for me. I darted forward, snatching them up before rats or pigeons could. Other nights I wasn't so lucky. I watched people toss half-eaten sandwiches into bins and prayed that no one else would find them before I did. Often the bins were too high, the lids too heavy, and I could only smell what I could never taste. I remember pressing my nose against the cold metal, whining softly as if the food inside might hear me and crawl out on its own. But more than hunger, I feared people. Not all, but enough to keep me wary. Some chased me away with sticks or stones when I lingered too close to their stalls. Others shouted words I didn't understand, but whose anger pierced me all the same. Once, a man hurled boiling water in my direction when I dared nose through his bin. The water missed by inches, but the hiss of steam and the smell of burnt ground haunted me for days. After that, I learned to keep to the shadows, to move only when eyes weren't watching. Hunger begged me to risk it all, but fear demanded silence. So I became invisible, a ghost with beating heart and starving belly. It was during the second week that the dreams began. Hunger does strange things to the mind. My body weakened, but my imagination grew wild. At night, when I closed my eyes beneath rusted staircases or abandoned stalls, I saw visions of feasts that had never been mine. Loaves of bread stacked higher than rooftops, bowls overflowing with meat, streams of cool water that shimmered like silver in the moonlight. I ran through these visions, teeth sinking into endless meals, belly full for the first time in weeks. But always the dream ended the same way. Just as I swallowed, the food turned to dust, crumbling into nothing in my mouth. I woke choking, pawing at empty ground, my stomach screaming louder than before. The third week nearly broke me. Rain poured for days without pause, soaking my frail body and turning the ground into mud. My paws slipped, my bones ached, and every step was agony. Finding food became harder than ever. The rain washed away scents, buried crumbs under sludge. I went nearly 3 days without finding even a crust. On the fourth day, weak and shivering, I stumbled into a marketplace after the storm had eased. The stalls were empty, the vendors gone, but pigeons scattered across the ground, pecking furiously at something. I pushed through them, ignoring their wings that struck my face, and found a scattering of crumbs, tiny, soaked, barely recognizable as bread. I devoured them as if they were a banquet, each soggy bite both relief and humiliation. My body wanted more, always more, but I gave thanks for those miserable pieces because they kept me standing. By the fourth week, I no longer resembled the dog I once was. My reflection in puddles startled me. A creature stared back, ribs like prison bars, eyes sunken deep, tail hanging limp like a forgotten rope. If someone had seen me then, they might have thought I was already dead, a shell still moving out of habit rather than will. But I was alive, and that fact alone was my rebellion. I refused to collapse. Every crumb became a victory. Every sunrise became proof that hunger hadn't won. There were moments, though, when I nearly gave up. Once I wandered near a busy street, and the smell of bread drifted from a cart nearby. I stumbled toward it only to be shoved aside by a man's boot. I fell hard, the world spinning around me, my body refusing to rise. I lay there, rain dripping onto my face, and wondered if this was the end. But then I smelled it, a small scrap beside the curb, nearly trampled into the mud. I crawled to it, teeth scraping against the ground, and swallowed it whole. That single bite reignited something in me. Weak as I was, I pulled myself to my paws and limped onward. One more crumb, one more night. By the end of the fifth week, I began to notice patterns. The bakery on 7th Street always had leftover crumbs scattered near its back alley on Mondays. The park benches yielded crusts after school children left in the afternoons. A cafe tossed out hardened baguettes on Thursday nights. I mapped these places in my mind, dragging myself from one to the next, holding on to these tiny certainties like lifelines. I was starving, but I was learning. Hunger was my teacher, and survival was the lesson carved into my bones. The 40th day came like all the others, without promise, without change. My body was weaker than ever, every movement slow, every breath shallow. I thought perhaps this was simply life now. Endless nights, endless crumbs, endless waiting. But that day something shifted. A voice reached me, soft yet sharp against the silence. I lifted my head, ears twitching. Two figures approached, their footsteps steady, their eyes searching the shadows. Unlike others, they did not curse or chase me. Instead, one knelt low, holding out a hand that smelled of kindness. My body trembled, torn between fear and desperate hope. And then, in that moment, I realized, perhaps my survival had not been meaningless. Perhaps the 40 days of breadcrumbs had led me to this very second. The two figures who found me that day moved differently from the others I had learned to fear. They didn't rush at me with angry steps, nor did they kick at the ground to scare me away. Their voices carried no cruelty, only concern, though my ears were too clouded by fear to fully trust them. One of them was a woman with hair tied back beneath a cap, and the other a man carrying a bag that smelled faintly of medicine and soap. They wore bright vests with symbols I didn't understand, but something about them felt safe. Still, my body was too conditioned to flee. I tried to back away, but my legs buckled beneath me, trembling with the effort. I collapsed onto the cold stone, panting heavily. The woman crouched low, whispering words I could not understand, but whose tone wrapped around me like a blanket. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small and fragrant, a piece of soft bread. The smell struck me like lightning. My nose twitched, my stomach roared, and every instinct screamed for me to leap forward and seize it. Yet exhaustion held me down. I could only inch closer, dragging my frail body forward, until at last the bread touched my lips. I devoured it in a single bite, my teeth scraping against her fingers in desperation. But she didn't pull away. She simply smiled, her eyes soft, and offered me another piece. Slowly my panic began to ebb. The man set his bag down and unfolded a blanket, spreading it on the ground. They moved with patience, never rushing me, never forcing me. After weeks of cruelty and indifference, I was stunned by their gentleness. For the first time in 40 days, I felt seen. They spoke softly to each other before carefully lifting me into their arms. My body was weightless, a feather from all the muscle and fat I had lost, and yet I felt as if I were being carried by giants. Their warmth seeped into my bones as I was wrapped in the blanket. The world blurred around me, the alleys, the puddles, the endless bins, all fading into the background. My nose pressed against the woman's chest, catching the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. I wanted to close my eyes, to surrender at last, but a flicker of fear still gnawed at me. Where were they taking me? Would they cast me aside like the others had? My life had been one long series of disappointments. Could I trust this to be different? The journey ended at a place filled with strange smells. Disinfectant, fur, medicine, and the faint aroma of food. It was overwhelming, yet not unpleasant. They laid me gently on a soft table where bright lights glared above me. More humans gathered, some with masks covering their faces, their hands gloved. They prodded me gently, listened to my heart, examined my thin body, and spoke in urgent but steady voices. Needles pricked my skin, and though fear surged through me, I was too weak to resist. Instead, I lay still, my eyes searching for the woman who had fed me. She stayed near, her hand resting on my paw, whispering softly. That single touch anchored me through the whirlwind of sounds and lights. I drifted in and out of sleep for days. When I woke, I found myself in a clean space with warm blankets, a bowl of water, and food that seemed almost unreal. Real bread, soft kibble, even bits of meat. At first I ate cautiously, expecting the dream to dissolve into dust as it always had, but each bite remained, solid and filling, spreading strength back into my frail body. My ribs no longer stabbed against my skin. My eyes regained their spark. Slowly, piece by piece, I began to resemble a dog again, not a shadow of one. The humans cared for me tirelessly. They cleaned my wounds, brushed my fur, and let me sleep without fear of being chased away. They called me by a name I didn't know, but I began to recognize the kindness in their voices. One evening, I overheard them speaking with hushed reverence. The woman leaned over me, stroking my head, while the man shook his head in disbelief. From their gestures, I understood that they were amazed I had survived. Later, another human, older and with glasses perched on his nose, examined me and spoke a word I didn't know. Miracle. I didn't understand the language, but I could feel the weight of their emotions. They looked at me as if I had accomplished something impossible, and perhaps I had, surviving 40 days on crumbs, enduring storms, beatings, and hunger. It had nearly destroyed me, but I was alive, against all odds I had endured. Yet survival wasn't the end of the story. Healing was its own journey, one that required as much strength as those 40 days of hunger. My body healed faster than my mind. The first time a door shut loudly nearby, I flinched, memories of being abandoned flooding back. When a stranger reached for me too quickly, I cowered, waiting for the strike that never came. Trust was harder to rebuild than muscle, but the humans were patient. They never forced me, never punished me for fear. They simply waited, offering food, gentle touches, and soft words until my fear began to loosen its grip. Over time, I discovered joy again. The first time I wagged my tail, it surprised even me. It had been so long since I felt safe enough to express happiness. The humans laughed, delighted by the small gesture, and it encouraged me to try again. Soon I was walking with steadier steps, sniffing the air with curiosity rather than fear. I learned the sound of footsteps that meant kindness, the rattle of bowls that meant food, the soft whistle that called me to safety. The world, once a place of danger and despair, became a place of hope. But what struck me most was the realization that I had not survived alone for nothing. My suffering had meaning. Those 40 days of breadcrumbs had led me to this place, to these people, to this chance at life. I was not just a stray forgotten by the world. I was a survivor, a symbol of endurance. Humans who visited the shelter whispered about me, their eyes wide with amazement. Some cried when they heard my story. They touched me gently as though afraid I might break, and yet looked at me as though I were made of steel. For the first time, I was not invisible. For the first time, my existence mattered. The woman who had first given me bread became more than a rescuer. She was my anchor, the one I trusted above all. Each day she sat beside me, reading softly from papers I couldn't understand, or simply resting her hand on my back as I drifted to sleep. I followed her with my eyes whenever she moved, afraid she might vanish as suddenly as those who had abandoned me. But she always returned, always. And with each return, my trust grew stronger. It was then I realized I had not just survived, I had been saved. The day I walked out of the shelter on my own paws, the sun felt different on my fur. It wasn't the biting heat of the streets, nor the cold emptiness of the rain-soaked nights. It was warmth, true warmth, that seeped into my body and reminded me what life was meant to feel like. My body had grown stronger, the hollow spaces around my ribs filling in again. My eyes no longer darted in panic at every sound. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I wasn't thinking about where the next crumb of bread would come from. I was thinking about the path ahead. The woman who had found me, my rescuer, my anchor, was there holding the leash loosely in her hands, though she barely needed it. I walked beside her willingly, step for step, my head tilted upward to catch her smile. I had learned to trust that smile. It was the same one that had fed me, the same one that had stayed by my side in the darkest nights of recovery. And now it was leading me to a place I had never dared to imagine, a home. When we arrived, the air was filled with scents of grass, wood, and something delicious drifting from an open window. A small house stood before us, modest but alive with warmth. A boy played in the yard, his laughter cutting through the air like music I had once forgotten. He turned as we approached, his eyes lighting up with joy at the sight of me. He ran forward, dropping his ball, and though part of me tensed at the sudden movement, his laughter soothed me. I wagged my tail, cautious at first, then stronger, until my whole body swayed with it. The boy knelt, reaching out, and when his hands touched my fur, I didn't flinch. I leaned into him instead, pressing my head against his chest. His heartbeat was quick, excited, but steady, and it reminded me of the boy I had lost long ago. In that moment, something inside me healed. The woman smiled at the scene, her eyes soft with emotion. She spoke to the boy and his family, and they welcomed me with open arms. They placed a new bowl on the floor, filled not with scraps or crumbs, but with food rich and plentiful. They laid out a bed in the corner, soft and warm, and though it was mine, I spent most of my first nights curled at the boy's feet, listening to his breathing as he slept. I was no longer a ghost on the streets, I was part of a family again. But the journey of healing doesn't end when the hunger fades. There were still nights when I woke suddenly, my heart racing, certain I had been abandoned again. In those moments, the house was quiet, the boy asleep, the woman resting in her room. Fear clawed at me, urging me to run, to hide, to prepare for loss. Yet each time I forced myself to stay. Each morning, without fail, the family returned to me with smiles, food, and love. Slowly, my fears began to loosen their grip. Trust took root where once only doubt had lived. One day, as I lay in the yard with the boy, the woman sat beside me. She stroked my fur, her voice soft, and though I didn't understand her words, I understood her meaning. She was telling me I was safe, that I would never again be left to scavenge for crumbs, that my 40 days of hunger were behind me, and my future would be filled with warmth and care. My eyes closed, and for the first time in months, I rested deeply, without fear of waking to an empty world. Weeks passed, then months. My body grew strong, my coat glossy, my spirit light. I played with the boy in the yard, chased birds through the grass, and barked at the mailman with joy rather than terror. I had become more than a survivor. I had become alive again. The woman sometimes brought visitors, and they would point at me and whisper the word miracle. They told my story with tears in their eyes, amazed that a dog could endure such suffering and still wag his tail. I didn't know what miracle meant, but I felt it in their touch, their awe, their respect. I realized then that my survival was not just mine, it was a story of resilience, a reminder to everyone who heard it that even in the darkest times, hope can endure. Still, I never forgot those days of hunger. Sometimes when I lay beside my full bowl, I remembered the sting of emptiness, the taste of crumbs too small to silence the pain. Those memories humbled me, reminded me of where I had been and how far I had come. They made me grateful for every bite, every warm bed, every kind hand. And though I could never thank the woman with words, I thanked her with every wag of my tail, every nuzzle of my nose, every moment of trust I gave her. In the end, I understood something simple but profound. Survival is not just about enduring. It's about what comes after, the chance to heal, to belong, to love again. My 40 days of breadcrumbs were not the end of my story, but the beginning of it. They were the tests that proved my strength, the bridge that carried me to the people who would become my forever family. I had once been invisible, forgotten, abandoned. Now I was seen, I was loved, I was home. And so, when I look back on those days of hunger, I do not see only pain. I see the resilience that carried me through. I see the hands that finally reached for me. I see the boy's laughter, the woman's smile, the warmth of belonging. My name may not be written in books, my survival may not be known to the world at large, but in the hearts of those who love me, my story is eternal. I am a rescue dog. I survived 40 days on breadcrumbs, and I live to find not just food but family.